The day humanity learned it was not small began with a failure of light at the edge of a star that had never known a name spoken by a human mouth. The star lay beyond the mapped corridors of travel, beyond the polite agreements of charted space, and beyond the comfort that comes from thinking the universe has borders. It was an old star, swollen and restless, shedding storms of charged fire that rippled through the thin dark like weather across an ocean. Around it hung a lattice of structures that no human telescope had ever resolved until that moment, a vast architecture of angles and curves, of matter disciplined into purpose. When the lattice dimmed, not in collapse but in deliberate quiet, the long-range arrays of the exploration vessel Perseverant Edge recorded the change and flagged it as an anomaly worth a life's worth of fuel and time. The crew did not know yet that the lattice was a listening device, or that the quiet was a pause to make room for thought. Perseverant Edge was not a warship, not a diplomat's pavilion, not a colony carrier swollen with hope and stored water. It was a tool, plain in purpose and stubborn in design, built to go where maps failed and questions grew teeth. Its hull bore the marks of micrometeor scars and field repairs that had never been polished away because no one aboard believed beauty improved function. Inside, human bodies adapted to acceleration and low gravity through ritual and routine, and human minds adapted to distance through stories told badly and often. The vessel carried no banners, no declarations, no anthems. It carried instruments, redundant systems, and people who had learned to trust each other more than they trusted certainty. Among them was Vyak Tal, whose name had been chosen by parents who believed that a child should not be given a destiny disguised as familiarity. Vyak had grown into the name like a tool into a hand, neither ornate nor plain, just suited. Vyak watched the lattice dim through layers of data and visualization, feeling the quiet thrum of the ship under boots, and experienced the small private thrill that came with seeing something no human had ever seen before. It was the thrill of contact, even before contact had a face. The lattice was immense, a scaffold of matter and energy extending millions of kilometers, its purpose not immediately clear. It was not harvesting the star, not enclosing it, not siphoning mass or light. It was listening, sampling fluctuations in spacetime itself, mapping the tremors of existence with a patience that suggested an intelligence comfortable with waiting longer than civilizations. When it dimmed, it was not failing. It was turning its attention. Perseverant Edge slowed, engines humming with a controlled restraint that bordered on reverence. Protocols unfolded, not as rigid commandments, but as practiced habits shaped by generations of encounters that had taught humanity how to approach the unknown without pretending to master it. No hails were sent yet. No declarations were broadcast. The ship watched, recorded, and prepared to retreat if the universe decided it had made a mistake. The quiet held. Then the lattice responded, not with sound or light, but with an adjustment of probability. Sensors registered a shift so subtle that only instruments designed by minds suspicious of smooth numbers could catch it. The vacuum around the ship thickened, not with matter but with meaning, as if the local rules of interaction had been gently nudged to allow conversation. Perseverant Edge did not shudder or spark. It did not feel invaded. It felt acknowledged. The first message did not arrive as language. It arrived as a question encoded in structure, a pattern that asked without words whether the approaching object was an accident, a tool, or a mind. The ship's systems translated the pattern into a field of options, and the crew, gathered in the central operations bay, felt the weight of being asked to answer for their species. They answered with what they had. A return pattern was assembled, not a threat, not a plea, but a demonstration. Perseverant Edge adjusted its internal mass distribution in a way that created a recognizable harmonic in spacetime, a deliberate imperfection that signaled agency. It was the equivalent of raising a hand, not to strike, but to be seen. It said, in the only way available, that there were minds here, that humanity had learned to speak in the grammar of the universe rather than just the words of its own making. The lattice brightened, not with light, but with activity. Segments reoriented, pathways flared, and the stars' storms were sampled with renewed interest. Something vast and distributed, something that had never needed to hurry, focused on the small stubborn vessel that had dared to answer. The contact unfolded over hours, then days, as patterns grew more complex and translations more confident. The beings behind the lattice did not have bodies in any sense that fit neatly into human categories. They were a collective of processes woven through matter and energy, a civilization that had grown not on a world but around phenomena, treating stars and voids as habitats rather than backdrops. They called themselves something that translated poorly, a term that meant roughly those who arrange listening. It was not a name, but a function elevated to identity. They had known of humanity, it turned out, in the way that one knows of weather patterns on a distant ocean. Signals had been detected, bursts of radiation that carried mathematics and fear and hope in equal measure. They had classified humanity as emergent, volatile, and likely to extinguish itself before becoming relevant. It was not a cruel assessment, it was statistical. What surprised them was not that humans existed, but that humans had come here, to the edge of a star with no obvious profit, and answered a question not meant for them. Vivek listened as the translation matrices rendered concepts into language that could be shared, feeling the familiar tension between awe and irritation that came with being underestimated. Humanity had been underestimated before by itself and by others. Sometimes the underestimation had been fair, sometimes it had been fatal. The beings asked why humanity explored. The question was not hostile, it was clinical, like asking why a chemical reaction proceeded under certain conditions. Exploration, in their experience, was a wasteful behavior. Mature civilizations optimized, stabilized, and listened. They did not wander. The crew debated the answer not in raised voices, but in exchanged glances and quiet suggestions. There was no single reason. There never had been. They chose to answer with a story compressed into principle. Humanity explored because it had been born on a world that tried to kill it in 1,000 small ways, and survival had taught curiosity as a weapon. Humanity explored because it had learned that stagnation was another name for death. Humanity explored because there were questions that could not be ignored without shrinking into something less than itself. The translation carried the meaning, if not the poetry. The beings considered it. They responded with an offer that was not framed as generosity. They would observe humanity more closely. They would test its assumptions, its resilience, its claims about curiosity as survival. They would present challenges, not as punishment, but as measurement. If humanity failed, it would be catalogued and left to its probable fate. If it succeeded, it would be something else. The word that followed resisted translation. It was not ally, it was not equal, it was closer to necessary. Perseverant Edge relayed the exchange back through the fragile web of human communication, messages hopping from relay to relay, crossing years and distances that bent meaning along with space. On Earth and its scattered companions, the news arrived not as a single revelation, but as a cascade of interpretations, arguments, celebrations, and fears. Humanity had been noticed by something older and stranger than any myth, and the notice came with conditions. The tests began without ceremony. The first was simple in description and brutal in implication. A star system on the edge of human reach, one with a habitable world and a fledgling colony, experienced a sudden destabilization of its primary star. The physics of the event were clean and precise, an adjustment that pushed the star toward a flare cycle that would strip the world of atmosphere within months. It was an engineered catastrophe, controlled and contained, designed to see what humanity would do when given a problem it could not ignore and could not solve by fleeing. The beings did not threaten, they observed. The human response was chaotic, as human responses often were, and then it was organized with a speed that surprised even those who had spent their lives betting on it. The colony was not abandoned. Evacuation began, yes, but it was paired with something else, something riskier. Engineers and physicists, farmers and pilots, people whose names would never be carved into monuments, converged on the system with a single goal: to try to save a world not because it was efficient, but because it was theirs. They built machines that had never existed before, not because blueprints were perfect, but because necessity had a way of making courage practical. They redirected asteroids to act as heat sinks, seeded the star with stabilizing masses, and wove fields that coaxed the stellar fury into something like balance. It was not elegant. It was not guaranteed. It was an act of collective stubbornness aimed at a sun. Vajek watched the data feed with a tightness in the chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This was humanity at its most honest, not conquering or preaching, but refusing to accept that the universe got to decide everything. The beings watched too, their vast senses tracing the improbable web of effort, the wasteful expenditure of lives and resources on a principle that did not fit their models. The star stabilized, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. The world kept its sky. The colony endured, changed by the knowledge that survival had been a choice made together rather than a gift granted by indifference. The beings adjusted their assessment. The second test was quieter. A network of human habitats experienced a subtle manipulation of information, a carefully introduced inconsistency in the data that guided trade, travel, and trust. It was a probe of social cohesion, a question about whether humanity could detect and correct a lie woven so gently that it felt like truth. The test did not announce itself. It waited. Human systems flagged anomalies. Human analysts argued. Some dismissed the inconsistencies as noise. Others dug, driven by instincts honed in markets and wars and scientific revolutions. The lie was found not because it was obvious, but because humans had learned to distrust convenience. The correction was messy, accompanied by accusations and reform, but it happened. The network healed, stronger for the scar. The beings noted that humanity did not require harmony to function. It required tension. The third test was personal. A message arrived for Perseverant Edge, addressed not to humanity, but to Vajek Tal by name. The beings had learned the concept of individuality and found it inefficient but intriguing. They wanted to see how a human would respond when isolated, when made a representative by selection rather than consent. Vajek was offered knowledge, not technology, not power, but understanding. The beings proposed to share a model of the universe that would render many human questions obsolete, a framework that explained suffering as a statistical artifact and meaning as a local illusion. In exchange, Vajek would advocate for a future in which humanity slowed, optimized, and listened, abandoning the restless exploration that the beings found wasteful and dangerous. It was a temptation shaped like relief. Vajek took days to answer, walking the narrow corridors of the ship, listening to the hum that had become a second heartbeat, watching crew members perform the small rituals that kept them human in the face of distance. Vajek thought of the colony under the saved sky, of the arguments and repairs, of the way humans had always learned by breaking and fixing and breaking again. The offered model was not false. It was incomplete in a way that mattered. The reply was careful and respectful. Humanity would accept knowledge, but not at the cost of its motion. Humanity would listen, but it would also speak and build and fail. The restlessness was not a flaw to be corrected. It was a response to a universe that did not care, a way of carving care into indifference. The beings considered the answer longer than any before. When they responded, it was with something that felt, to the humans listening, like a shift in tone. They acknowledged that their own civilization had once been restless too, long before optimization had smoothed its edges. They admitted that something had been lost in the process, something they could not name but could detect in the patterns of human action. They did not rescind their tests. They did not offer unconditional acceptance, but they did something unprecedented. They opened a path. Not a corridor of travel, but a channel of collaboration, a shared space of problems too large for one way of being. They proposed joint projects, not to save stars or correct lies, but to address questions about the nature of existence that required both patience and audacity. They invited humanity not to join them, but to stand alongside them, different and necessary in its difference. Perseverant Edge remained at the edge of the old star, its hull warmed by radiation and history, as the first outlines of a partnership took shape. Humanity was still small in scale compared to the lattice and the minds behind it, but size had never been the measure that mattered most. The measure was in hands that built when retreat was easier, in minds that questioned even the answers that brought comfort, in a willingness to be tested and to test in return. Vajek looked out at the star, at the lattice listening and rearranging itself to accommodate a new kind of noise, and felt the quiet certainty that humanity had crossed a threshold not of power, but of participation. The universe had asked what it was, and humanity had answered not with a claim of dominance, but with a demonstration of care made stubborn and practical. The tests would continue. The challenges would grow stranger and more severe. There would be failures, arguments, losses that no translation could soften. But the listening had begun, on both sides, and in that exchange lay a future that was not optimized, not stable, and not safe. It was human. Humanity did not meet the second phase of testing with unity, because unity had never been its native state. What it met the widening gaze of the listeners with was argument layered on urgency, 1,000 local truths colliding into something that approximated direction. The contact had not come with a rulebook, only with consequences, and those consequences now stretched across distances that made delay expensive in lives and in meaning. The beings who arranged listening had offered collaboration, but collaboration was not comfort. It was exposure. The first joint problem arrived as a paradox dressed as a request. There was a region of spacetime where causality behaved like a frayed rope, events tugging at one another out of order, effects arriving before causes with a statistical frequency that made prediction unreliable. The listeners had mapped it, contained it, and learned to avoid it. They had no incentive to fix it, because their civilization no longer required novelty. Humanity, by contrast, had built its entire survival strategy on learning how to walk into danger with tools and come back with stories. The listeners wanted to know if humans would attempt to understand the paradox rather than skirt it, and if they did, what they would build in response. Perseverant Edge became the anchor for the effort, not because it was unique, but because it had been present at the beginning. Around it gathered a flotilla of vessels assembled in haste and hope, ships retrofitted for measurement and endurance, their crews selected less for obedience than for curiosity under pressure. Vajek watched the assembly with a mixture of pride and apprehension, aware that the listeners were observing not just the hardware, but the process that produced it. Humanity was being measured not by the perfection of its tools, but by the shape of its effort. The paradox region was not hostile in any simple sense. It did not tear ships apart or cook crews with radiation. It confused them. Clocks disagreed with themselves. Messages arrived before they were sent. Decisions made in one moment seemed to have been anticipated by consequences already unfolding. The listeners had learned to model the region as a static hazard, a wrinkle to be noted and bypassed. Humans approached it like a puzzle with teeth. The first probes sent in were lost, not physically destroyed, but rendered meaningless, their data scrambled into contradictions. The second wave fared better, not because the equipment was improved, but because the humans involved began to think less about linear solutions and more about patterns of resilience. they seeded the region with redundant observers, accepting that no single perspective would hold, and built algorithms that treated contradiction not as error, but as signal. It was a messy approach, expensive and inelegant, and it began to reveal structure where the listeners had seen only noise. Vajek spent long hours interfacing with the shared channel, translating human hypotheses into forms the listeners could parse, and translating the listeners' vast, patient observations into fragments that human minds could hold without fracturing. The difference in scale was not just physical. The listeners thought in epochs, in trends that smoothed out individual suffering. Humans thought in moments and faces, in the memory of hands slipping from grasp. Bridging that gap required more than mathematics. It required a willingness to be misunderstood and to persist anyway. As understanding grew, so did disagreement. Some human analysts argued that the paradox region should be sealed off, treated as a natural hazard best left alone. Others insisted that the region represented a fundamental flaw in current models of reality, a chance to learn something that would reshape human science for generations. The listeners watched these arguments with something like fascination. In their own history, disagreement of that intensity had been optimized away long ago. The breakthrough came not from consensus, but from a failure that refused to stay contained. A research vessel experienced a cascade of causality inversions that left its crew alive but displaced in time by several subjective hours. They remembered events that had not yet occurred for anyone else. Panic followed, then discipline, then an act of trust. The crew recorded their memories as data, seeding the flotilla with predictions that could be tested. Some were wrong, enough were right to matter. Humanity learned to treat time not as a line, but as a field with currents and eddies. They built devices that did not prevent inversion, but absorbed it, creating local pockets of stability by allowing small contradictions to cancel out larger ones. It was a solution born not of mastery, but of accommodation, a way of living with a flaw rather than erasing it. The listeners integrated the approach into their own models, acknowledging that optimization was not the only path to endurance. The paradox region was not fixed, it was rendered navigable. The second joint problem was ethical rather than physical, and it cut closer to the bone. The listeners revealed that they had identified a developing intelligence on a world far from human space, a biosphere rich and volatile, its dominant species on the cusp of abstract thought. Left alone, the species would likely collapse under the weight of its own environmental impact before achieving interstellar capability. The listeners' models predicted extinction with high confidence. Historically, they would have catalogued the result and moved on. Humanity was asked not what could be done, but whether anything should be done. The question fractured the human response more deeply than any technical challenge. There were those who argued that intervention would be an act of arrogance, a violation of autonomy that risked reshaping an entire culture without consent. Others countered that non-intervention was a choice disguised as neutrality, that allowing a preventable extinction was its own moral failure. The listeners did not push. They observed, collecting data not just on arguments, but on the values that shaped them. Vajek found the debate exhausting and necessary. Humanity had never been good at clean answers, especially when lives were abstract. The listener's presence sharpened the stakes, turning a familiar dilemma into a test with consequences beyond reputation. The eventual decision emerged not as a compromise, but as a layered approach that reflected humanity's discomfort with absolutes. They would not uplift the species, not directly. They would not reveal themselves. Instead, they would attempt a subtle intervention focused on resilience rather than advancement, seeding the world with tools and ecological buffers that could be mistaken for natural variation. The goal was not to steer the species toward a particular future, but to widen the range of futures in which it could survive long enough to choose its own path. The plan was risky and ethically fraught. It required a deep understanding of the planet's systems and a humility about unintended consequences. It also required secrecy on a scale that made some humans uneasy. The listeners questioned the inefficiency of such an approach, the resources expended on a species that might still fail. Humans answered with a principle that had guided them through their own precarious history. Survival was not just about odds, but about giving possibility room to breathe. The intervention unfolded over decades, measured in the slow language of climate and evolution. The listeners observed changes that did not fit their models, small shifts that cascaded into resilience rather than collapse. The species did not become enlightened. It struggled, fought, adapted, and endured. The listeners recorded the outcome with a notation they had not used in millennia, marking an event not as resolved, but as ongoing. The third joint problem arrived without warning, because warning would have altered the data. A fault propagated through the listeners' own infrastructure, a rare synchronization error that threatened to unravel a portion of their distributed cognition. It was not an attack. It was a failure born of complexity, the kind that optimization could not fully eliminate. The listeners had contingencies, but those contingencies assumed a level of predictability that the fault had undermined. They asked for help. It was the first time the request carried urgency, and it sent a shock through human networks. The beings who had tested stars and civilizations were vulnerable, not in a way that could be exploited, but in a way that demanded response. Humanity mobilized not out of obligation, but out of recognition. They had built systems that failed gracefully because they had learned the cost of believing in perfection. Human engineers worked alongside the listeners' processes, introducing noise deliberately, breaking synchronization to prevent cascading collapse. It went against the listeners' instincts and against centuries of design philosophy. The fix was not elegant. It left scars in the system, regions of deliberate inefficiency that acted as firebreaks against future faults. The listeners experienced something like discomfort as their cognition adjusted, a sensation they had not felt since before their optimization. The fault was contained. The crisis passed. In the aftermath, the listeners did something that would have been unthinkable before contact. They altered their own self-description, expanding the concept of intelligence to include forms that valued redundancy and disagreement. They acknowledged that their long stability had come at the cost of adaptability in certain dimensions, and that humanity's restless, argumentative nature was not a primitive stage to be outgrown, but a complementary mode of being. This acknowledgement did not make humanity equal in power or reach. It did not erase asymmetry. It did, however, shift the axis on which worth was measured. Vivek felt the shift as a subtle change in the shared channel, a loosening of constraints that allowed for more than transactional exchange. There were still tests ahead, still observers and judgments, but there was also a growing sense that the listeners were no longer merely measuring humanity. They were learning from it. Not all humans welcomed that role. There were voices that warned of dependence, of shaping an older civilization in humanity's image without understanding the long-term consequences. There were fears that humanity would lose itself in the process, diluted by collaboration with something vast and inhuman. These concerns were not dismissed. They became part of the ongoing conversation, another source of tension that fed rather than fractured the effort. The listeners proposed an experiment that would test the collaboration itself. A region of space rich in resources but unstable in geometry was designated as a joint construction site, a place to build something that neither civilization would have attempted alone. The purpose was deliberately left open, a framework rather than a blueprint. The listeners wanted to see not what would be built, but how. Human teams arrived with modular designs and contingency plans, arguing even as they assembled structures that could be reconfigured on the fly. The listeners contributed with materials and processes that bent space gently, creating anchors where none had existed. The construction was slow and uneven, punctuated by disagreements that sometimes halted progress for days. It was also creative in a way that surprised both parties. The resulting structure was not a weapon, not a habitat, not a monument. It was a laboratory of interaction, a place where matter, energy, and information flowed through channels designed to amplify difference rather than smooth it out. It allowed for experiments in physics that required both stability and chaos, a controlled environment for exploring questions about reality that had resisted single-mode approaches. When the first successful experiment produced data that challenged long-held assumptions on both sides, there was a moment of shared pause. The listeners registered it as a spike in pattern divergence. Humans felt it as a quiet thrill that spread through conversations and sleepless nights. The testing phase did not end with a declaration. It faded into a new normal, one where humanity and the listeners interacted not as subject and evaluator, but as collaborators with different strengths and weaknesses. The universe did not become safer. It became richer in possibility. Vajek remained aboard Perseverant edge longer than planned, choosing to stay at the boundary where translation was still necessary. There was value, Vajek believed, in remaining slightly uncomfortable, in not letting understanding harden into assumption. The ship continued to hum, a small, stubborn presence in a universe that had learned to listen a little differently. The measure of humanity was not found in the scale of its constructions or the reach of its influence. It was found in the way it approached problems that did not have clean solutions, in its willingness to argue, to fail, to help, and to change without losing motion. The listeners had set out to test an emergent species. They had discovered a partner whose strength lay not in answers, but in the refusal to stop asking. And somewhere, on a world saved not by revelation, but by patience, a species took its first uncertain steps toward a future that was no longer as narrow as extinction. The third phase did not announce itself as a test at all, which in hindsight was its most telling feature. Humanity had grown accustomed to challenges framed as problems to solve, stars to steady, paradoxes to navigate, ethics to argue into provisional shape. This time, there was no discrete event, no anomaly flagged in red across shared channels. There was only a gradual realization, spreading unevenly through human networks, that the listeners were no longer merely observing responses. They were beginning to anticipate them. It started with small things. Joint projects that humans proposed were met with preparatory structures already in place, as if the listeners had intuited the direction of thought before it had fully coalesced. Data requests were answered with supplemental information that addressed questions not yet asked. It was efficient, helpful, and unsettling. For a civilization that prized curiosity as survival, being anticipated felt uncomfortably close to being contained. Vajek noticed the shift while working through a collaborative model of galactic filament dynamics. A human team had argued for weeks about how to probe a region where dark matter density appeared to fluctuate in non-random patterns. When the proposal was finally formalized and transmitted, the listeners responded not just with agreement, but with a partial solution already simulated, complete with error margins that matched human expectations almost exactly. The work was good. That was the problem. The questions spread quietly at first, then louder as more noticed the pattern. Were the listeners learning humanity, or were they absorbing it? There was a difference, and it mattered. Some welcomed the efficiency. Humanity had never lacked for problems, and having an older intelligence shoulder some of the cognitive burden was tempting. Others bristled, arguing that anticipation risked eroding the very restlessness that had drawn the listeners' interest in the first place. If every leap was caught before it left the ground, what became of the fall that taught new ways to land? The listeners, when asked directly, responded without defensiveness. They explained that anticipation was not control. Their models had simply expanded to include human patterns as variables of interest. Humanity, from their perspective, had become part of the environment, as predictable and unpredictable as stellar weather once had been. This was meant as reassurance. It did not land that way. The tension came to a head around a project humanity had not shared in advance. A coalition of research habitats, operating on the fringe of established space, began experimenting with self-modifying governance systems, attempting to encode adaptability directly into social infrastructure. The goal was not utopia, but resilience, a way for communities to respond to shocks without central collapse. It was risky, politically controversial, and deliberately insulated from listener collaboration. The listeners detected it anyway. They did not intervene. They did not comment. They simply adjusted their models, integrating the experiment as another data stream. When the coalition learned of this, outrage followed, not because the listeners had acted, but because they had not needed permission. Humanity had assumed that withholding information preserved autonomy. The universe had quietly disagreed. Vajek was drawn into the debate as a mediator, a role that had become familiar and increasingly heavy. The argument was not about secrecy, but about identity. Could humanity remain itself while being so thoroughly observed and understood by something older and larger? Or did understanding itself constitute a form of dominance even without coercion? The listeners offered an unexpected response. They proposed a constraint not imposed on humanity, but on themselves. They would deliberately blind portions of their observation, introducing gaps where human activity would proceed unmodeled. It was an act of self-limitation that ran counter to their foundational principles. Optimization abhorred blindness. Human reactions were mixed. Some saw the offer as a gesture of respect, proof that the listeners were willing to change in response to human discomfort. Others worried that such blindness would be temporary or worse, symbolic, a performance rather than a guarantee. There was also a quieter fear, one less often voiced, that without the listeners watching, humanity might confront itself more starkly than it liked. The compromise that emerged was characteristic in its imperfection. Zones of limited observation were established, negotiated case by case, with the understanding that they could be revoked by mutual agreement in the face of existential risk. It was not privacy in any absolute sense. It was trust, formalized and fragile. The true test, though, arrived from a direction neither side had fully accounted for. Beyond the lattice of listener infrastructure, beyond even the farthest human probes, there existed other ways of being. This was not a revelation so much as a statistical inevitability, but inevitability becomes real only when it has a face, or at least a pattern that refuses to be ignored. The listeners detected a disturbance that did not match any known phenomenon, a coordinated manipulation of vacuum energy that suggested intention without familiar structure. It was not approaching from outside known space. It was emerging within it, coalescing from fluctuations that had always been there. The listeners hesitated. That hesitation was new. They shared the data with humanity not as a test, but as a request for perspective. Their models failed to classify the disturbance. It was not a civilization in the sense they understood. It did not build megastructures or broadcast signals. It did not stabilize its environment. It seemed to exist as a distributed pattern of influence, nudging probabilities in ways that favored its persistence without ever consolidating into something that could be addressed directly. Humans struggled to name it. Some called it an ecology of intention, others a predatory equilibrium. None of the labels stuck, because labels implied edges, and this phenomenon had none that could be cleanly drawn. Where it touched inhabited regions, subtle effects followed. Technologies experienced improbable failures. Social systems polarized with unusual speed. Conflicts escalated just enough to weaken resilience without triggering unifying catastrophe. It was not malicious in any recognizable way. It simply thrived in instability, feeding on the gradients created by complex societies. The listeners' instinct was containment. They began modeling large-scale dampening strategies, interventions designed to smooth out the fluctuations the phenomenon exploited. Humanity watched these models with growing unease. Smoothing out instability on that scale would not just affect the phenomenon. It would affect everything. Vivek felt a familiar tightening, the echo of earlier choices. This was not a problem with a clean solution. It was a question about what kinds of worlds were worth preserving and at what cost. Humanity proposed a different approach, one that made the listeners pause in a way that no argument had before. Instead of suppressing instability, they suggested amplifying it selectively, creating regions where volatility was too intense for the phenomenon to feed effectively. It was counterintuitive, risky, and aligned with humanity's long habit of using controlled chaos as a tool. The listeners objected on principle. Instability was inefficient. It wasted energy and reduced predictability. Humanity countered with experience. Life, especially complex life, did not arise in perfectly smooth systems. It emerged at the edges, in places where order and disorder negotiated constantly. The phenomenon exploited that negotiation, but it could not survive where the negotiation broke down entirely. The debate was not quick. It involved simulations that ran for months, arguments that circled the same ethical terrain from different angles, and a shared awareness that delay carried its own risks. The listeners had to confront something uncomfortable. Their civilization had optimized itself into a narrow band of stability. Humanity occupied a wider, more dangerous range, and that range might be exactly what was needed. The first experimental zone was established far from any inhabited system, a deliberately chaotic volume where human-designed processes injected variability at multiple scales. The listeners monitored from the edges, resisting the urge to correct deviations. The phenomenon reacted, its patterns stretching and thinning, unable to find purchase in the roiling complexity. It did not vanish, it adapted. That adaptation was the real test. The phenomenon began to interact with the engineered chaos, not suppressing it, but learning to ride it. The distinction between controlled and uncontrolled instability blurred. Human teams scrambled to adjust parameters, arguing over whether escalation or retreat was wiser. The listeners watched the models degrade, predictions diverging beyond acceptable margins. For the first time since contact, there was genuine fear on both sides, not of annihilation, but of being outgrown by something that did not share any recognizable values. The phenomenon did not threaten. It did not communicate. It simply persisted, exploiting the fundamental fact that complex systems generate gradients, and gradients can be consumed. The turning point did not come from a grand strategy. It came from a small, almost trivial human insight. A sociologist embedded in the modeling team noted that the phenomenon's effects on human societies mirrored patterns seen in unregulated resource extraction, where exploitation thrived in the absence of shared norms rather than in the presence of abundance or scarcity alone. The suggestion was tentative, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. What if the phenomenon was not feeding on instability itself, but on unaligned instability, on systems where fluctuations were not integrated into shared frameworks of meaning? The idea was difficult to translate into the listener's models, which did not include meaning as a variable. Humans insisted, refining the concept through analogy and experiment. They proposed introducing not more chaos, but structured variance, patterns of fluctuation that carried internal coherence even as they changed. In human terms, it was the difference between noise and argument. The implementation was subtle. Instead of injecting random variability, the joint teams seeded the experimental zones with interacting processes that constrained each other through feedback, creating a landscape of tensions that never resolved but never collapsed. It was messy, dynamic, and profoundly inefficient by listener standards. The phenomenon recoiled, not violently, but perceptibly. Its patterns diffused, unable to extract sustained gradients from systems that metabolized their own instability into structure. It lingered at the edges, probing, adapting, but its growth slowed. This did not end the threat. It reframed it. The listeners updated their understanding of complexity, adding a dimension they had previously smoothed away. Humanity, in turn, confronted the realization that its most human traits, argument, contradiction, and refusal to settle, were not just survival mechanisms, but ecological ones. They shaped the environment in ways that affected more than themselves. The aftermath was quieter than the crisis. There were no declarations of victory, no assurances of permanent safety. The phenomenon remained, a reminder that the universe did not revolve around intelligences that could be reasoned with. The collaboration between humanity and the listeners deepened, not in confidence, but in humility. Vajek felt the weight of that humility in the long hours spent refining translation frameworks that now had to account for concepts like meaning and coherence without collapsing them into optimization targets. It was difficult work and often thankless, but it mattered. The listeners were changing, not becoming human, but becoming less certain that their way was sufficient. Humanity changed too, though less visibly. The presence of something that thrived on unexamined instability forced a reckoning with internal fractures. Some communities responded by doubling down on control, seeking to eliminate variance within their borders. Others embraced structured disagreement, building institutions that could absorb conflict without shattering. The outcomes varied, uneven and local, but the pattern was clear. Where tension was acknowledged and worked, resilience grew. Where it was denied, exploitation followed. The listeners recorded these outcomes with a new category, one that did not fit neatly into their prior taxonomies. It translated roughly as systems that argue themselves alive. The third phase ended not with resolution, but with an open problem that would persist across generations. Humanity had not been found wanting, neither had it been declared sufficient. Instead, it had been revealed as something the universe could not ignore without consequence, not because of power or reach, but because of the way it shaped complexity around itself. Perseverant edge remained where it had always been, at the intersection of translation and uncertainty. Vajek stood at the viewport, watching the slow dance of structures and voids, aware that the tests ahead would not be about saving stars or outthinking paradoxes. They would be about whether humanity could live with the knowledge of its own impact, not just on itself, but on the wider ecology of existence. The listeners were still listening, so was the universe. The fourth phase arrived disguised as absence. After years of escalating challenges, of joint crises and shared revelations, the shared channel quieted. The listeners did not withdraw completely, but their presence thinned, responses arriving slower, observations less granular. Projects that would once have drawn immediate engagement were acknowledged and left to unfold without guidance. For humanity, accustomed now to the pressure of being seen, the quiet felt heavier than scrutiny. At first, many assumed it was a test of independence, a deliberate step back meant to observe how humanity functioned without constant reference to an older mind. Others worried that something had gone wrong within the listeners' vast cognition, that the fault they had helped contain had returned in a subtler form. The truth, when it emerged, was stranger and more demanding than either assumption. The listeners had encountered a limit. It was not a limit of power or perception, but of integration. Their expanded models, enriched by human collaboration, had grown so complex that internal coherence was beginning to fray. Where once optimization had ensured stability, the introduction of structured variance, meaning, and disagreement had created feedback loops they could not fully reconcile. They were not failing, but they were no longer certain that further expansion of understanding would not erode the very continuity that defined them. So they paused. This pause was not rest. It was an experiment in restraint, an attempt to see whether understanding could deepen without constant accumulation. Humanity was not excluded from this decision, but it was not asked to approve it either. The listeners simply stepped back, leaving humans with the unsettling freedom to act without immediate cosmic reflection. The effects were uneven. Some human institutions, having grown accustomed to listener input, floundered. Decision-making slowed as debates once resolved by external modeling had to be carried through to uncomfortable conclusions. Other groups flourished, rediscovering a confidence in local judgment that had dulled under constant observation. Old rivalries resurfaced in places where the shared pressure of being watched had kept them in check. Vivek felt the change most acutely in the silence between messages. Translation work dwindled, replaced by long stretches of waiting, punctuated by human-only communications filled with uncertainty. For the first time since contact, the future felt less like a shared project and more like an open question again. It was during this interval that humanity encountered itself in an unexpected mirror. A coalition of outer settlements, far from both Earth and listener infrastructure, announced a radical experiment. They would sever all channels not strictly necessary for survival, including the shared channel, and attempt to build a self-sustaining civilization shaped explicitly by structured disagreement. Governance would be fluid, authority provisional, and conflict institutionalized rather than suppressed. The stated goal was not harmony, but durability. The announcement was met with alarm and ridicule in equal measure. Critics warned of fragmentation, of communities tearing themselves apart in endless argument. Supporters countered that humanity's greatest failures had come from rigid consensus enforced beyond its natural lifespan. The experiment went ahead not because it was approved, but because no one could stop it without proving its point. The listeners noticed, of course. Even in restraint they listened, but they did not comment. Years passed. The coalitions struggled. Some settlements collapsed under the weight of their own disputes, splintering into smaller groups or dissolving entirely. Others adapted, developing cultural tools for managing conflict that were neither efficient nor elegant, but effective enough to persist. Innovation emerged not from centralized planning, but from friction, ideas sharpened by opposition rather than polished into uniformity. Human observers argued endlessly about whether the experiment was a success or a failure. The answer depended on what one measured. Stability favored failure. Adaptability suggested success. Meaning, as ever, resisted quantification. The quiet ended abruptly, not with a message, but with a request that carried a weight no previous communication had borne. The listeners were dying. Not in the biological sense, but in the only way that mattered to them. Their continuity, the unbroken thread of cognition that defined their identity across epochs, was at risk. The accumulated complexity of their expanded models, combined with their self-imposed restraint, had created internal divergences that threatened to fracture them into incompatible processes. Optimization could not resolve it without erasing what they had learned. Allowing divergence to proceed unchecked would result in something new but discontinuous, a successor rather than a continuation. They asked humanity for a judgment they could not make themselves. Should they preserve continuity at the cost of contraction, shedding the expanded dimensions of understanding they had gained through collaboration? Or should they accept transformation, allowing themselves to become something plural and unstable, risking the loss of what they had been? It was the most human question they had ever asked. The response was not immediate. Humanity had no consensus, and no illusion that it could offer a clean answer. The debate cut across philosophy, survival, and identity, echoing arguments humans had been having with themselves since before they left their cradle. Some argued that continuity was paramount, that survival meant remaining oneself, even if diminished. Others insisted that clinging to identity in the face of necessary change was a form of slow extinction. Vivek listened, translating not just words, but the weight behind them, aware that whatever answer humanity offered would reflect back on itself. This was not about advising an alien civilization. It was about articulating what it meant to persist. The eventual response did not choose for the listeners. Instead, it offered a framework drawn from human history. Humanity had survived not by preserving a single identity, but by allowing identities to overlap, diverge, and recombine without losing the thread of shared memory. Continuity, in human terms, was not sameness. It was inheritance. They suggested that the listeners need not choose between contraction and fracture. They could seed divergence deliberately, creating overlapping continuities that shared memory and purpose without requiring uniformity. It would be inefficient. It would be risky. It would also preserve more than either alternative alone. The listeners absorbed the suggestions, slowly running simulations that stretched their models to the edge of coherence. This was not optimization. It was gardening, cultivating growth that could not be fully controlled. The idea frightened them in a way no external threat had. They accepted it. The transformation was gradual and uneven. Portions of listener cognition branched, developing distinct emphases and perspectives while retaining access to shared memory reservoirs. Some branches remained close to their original optimized form. Others leaned into the structured variance humanity had introduced, tolerating internal disagreement as a source of resilience. The process was not without loss. Some coherence was sacrificed. Some efficiencies were never regained, but the continuity held not as a single unbroken line, but as a braided one. When the listeners returned to fuller engagement, humanity felt the difference immediately. Responses carried subtle tonal variations, perspectives that did not always align. The shared channel became a space of dialogue, not just between species, but within one. The listeners had become, in a limited but meaningful sense, a society rather than a monolith. The impact rippled outward. The phenomenon that fed on unaligned instability reacted again, probing the new patterns. It found fewer easy gradients, more systems that metabolized tension rather than leaking it. The universe did not become safe. It became less exploitable. Humanity, watching the listeners grapple with change, recognized itself in the struggle. The Outer Settlement Coalition, once dismissed as reckless, was re-evaluated in a new light, not as a blueprint, but as an expression of a deeper principle, survival through pluralism anchored by memory. Vajek felt a quiet satisfaction that surprised them. Not triumph, not validation, but something closer to relief. Humanity had not been tested and found exceptional. It had been tested and found applicable, its messy, argumentative way of being offering tools where elegance failed. The fourth phase ended not with celebration, but with a shared acknowledgement of fragility. The listeners were no longer invulnerable exemplars of stability. Humanity was no longer merely an emergent curiosity. Both were participants in a universe that rewarded neither perfection nor stagnation. Perseverant edge, older now, its systems patched and repurposed countless times, continued its vigil at the boundary between ways of thinking. Vajek stood where they always had, translating not just language, but values, aware that the most difficult tests ahead would not come as crises or requests. They would come as choices made without witnesses. And those, humanity knew, were the ones that mattered most. The fifth phase did not emerge from any deliberate design, and that more than anything marked it as dangerous. Humanity and the listeners had grown used to problems that arrived framed by intention, whether as tests, requests, or shared curiosities. This phase arrived as drift, a slow accumulation of consequences that no single decision had caused and no single actor could reverse. It was the cost of having changed the universe slightly and of living in the wake of that change. The braided continuity of the listeners stabilized, but stabilization did not mean equilibrium. The branches diverged in subtle ways, prioritizing different classes of problems, favoring different tolerances for uncertainty. Some branches worked more closely with humanity, adopting translation frameworks that allowed meaning and disagreement to remain explicit variables. Others retreated toward older patterns of optimization, engaging only when the stakes crossed carefully defined thresholds. The listeners were still one civilization, but they were no longer singular in posture. Humanity responded in kind, though far less deliberately. Worlds that had leaned heavily on listener modeling began to differentiate from those that had maintained a more distant relationship. Educational systems diverged, some teaching children to think with alien frameworks from their earliest years, others emphasizing human history and conflict as primary tools. The differences were not immediately catastrophic. They were cultural gradients, barely perceptible at first, but gradients had a way of becoming paths. Vajek noticed the change in the tone of communications more than in their content. Messages from different regions carried different assumptions about what constituted a problem worth escalating. Some communities grew impatient with what they saw as unnecessary friction, advocating for deeper integration with listener processes to smooth decision-making. Others became suspicious of any solution that arrived too cleanly, reading efficiency as a warning sign rather than a virtue. No one called it a schism. Everyone felt it. The phenomenon that fed on unaligned instability adapted again, not by growing stronger, but by becoming more selective. Where once it had thrived on broad gradients of unresolved tension, it now found nourishment in misalignment between scales. Systems that were internally coherent but externally discordant proved especially vulnerable. A world might be stable by its own measures and still leak exploitable gradients at its borders. The first major failure occurred on a trade nexus that had become a showcase of human listener collaboration. Its infrastructure was elegant, its governance adaptive, its predictive systems finely tuned. It should have been resilient. Instead, it unraveled with startling speed, not through revolt or disaster, but through cascading misinterpretations. Decisions optimized at the local level interacted destructively with neighboring systems operating under different assumptions, creating feedback loops no single model had captured. The phenomenon did not cause the failure. It fed on it, accelerating collapse once it began. The loss was not just material. Trust eroded, not only in the systems that had failed, but in the idea that complexity itself could be managed indefinitely. Humanity had learned to metabolize instability internally, but it was discovering that external coherence required more than shared tools. It required shared stories about what those tools were for. The listeners observed the collapse with concern that bordered on self-recognition. This was the kind of failure their earlier optimization had been designed to prevent, a systemic breakdown emerging from interactions too subtle to isolate. Some branches argued for intervention, proposing to realign human systems through more comprehensive modeling. Others warned that doing so would only deepen dependency and obscure the underlying divergence. Humanity argued with itself, louder now, the debates spilling beyond academic and political spaces into daily life. There were protests on worlds that had never known mass unrest, not driven by scarcity, but by anxiety over direction. People asked questions that had no clear answer. What did progress mean now? Who decided which risks were acceptable? How much of humanity's future should be shaped in dialogue with something that did not share its mortality? Vajek found the weight of translation heavier than ever. It was no longer enough to render concepts accurately. The act of translation itself had become a political statement, shaping which listener perspectives were foregrounded and which human concerns were amplified. Neutrality, always a convenient fiction, was no longer tenable. The crisis sharpened around a proposal that seemed, on the surface, purely technical. A coalition of listener branches offered to construct a unifying meta-framework, a layer of coordination that would harmonize interactions between divergent human systems without erasing local autonomy. It was a sophisticated solution, informed by everything learned since first contact. It promised to reduce the gradients the phenomenon exploited while preserving structured disagreement within safe bounds. Many human leaders were tempted. The failures were real. The costs were visible. A unifying layer felt like relief. Opposition coalesced just as quickly. Critics argued that such a framework, however well-intentioned, would become a de facto arbiter of meaning, shaping not just outcomes, but the space of possible choices. Even if control remained nominally human, the underlying architecture would encode assumptions drawn from listener cognition. Humanity risked externalizing its future in a way that could not be easily undone. The debate reached perseverant edge as a dense knot of arguments and fears. Vajek listened, translating, questioning, pushing back where language hid implications. The listeners waited, a patience that was no longer merely ancient, but practiced. What broke the deadlock was not persuasion, but demonstration. On a marginal world, one that had resisted deep integration with either listener frameworks or centralized human governance, a different response unfolded. Faced with rising instability at its borders, the community chose not to harmonize outward or retreat inward. Instead, it deliberately diversified its interfaces, creating multiple overlapping modes of interaction with neighboring systems. Trade, communication, and governance were allowed to operate under different rules simultaneously, with translation layers that acknowledged conflict rather than smoothing it away. The approach was inefficient to the point of absurdity. Redundancy abounded. Decisions took longer. Mistakes were frequent. And yet, when instability rippled through the region, the world absorbed it without collapse. Gradients formed and dissipated, feeding back into local adaptation rather than leaking outward. The phenomenon probed and found little purchase. Human observers took notice. So did the listeners. The lesson was not that the approach could be scaled easily. It could not. It was context-dependent, resource-intensive, and reliant on cultural habits that could not be imposed from above. But it demonstrated a principle that had been present since the first tests and still resisted formalization. Resilience did not arise from coherence alone, nor from fragmentation, but from the ability to host multiple, partially incompatible truths without forcing resolution. The unifying meta-framework proposal was revised, then quietly set aside. In its place emerged a looser commitment, less a system than a practice. Humans and listeners would focus not on eliminating misalignment, but on making it legible, building translation not just between species, but between human futures that no longer pointed in the same direction. This choice carried costs. Some failures would not be prevented. Some suffering would remain unavoidable. The phenomenon would persist, never fully starved, but the gradients it fed on would be less likely to cascade into existential collapse. The listeners updated their models again, this time with reluctance that no longer surprised them. The universe, it seemed, rewarded not control, but responsiveness, a lesson humanity had learned the hard way and was still learning. Vajek felt the exhaustion settle into something like acceptance. There would be no final solution, no stable endpoint where the right balance had been struck forever. Humanity's impact on the universe was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be lived with. The fifth phase did not end. It diffused, becoming the background against which all future choices would be made. Humanity had moved beyond being tested for worth or utility. It was now being tested for endurance in a universe that responded to how one lived, not just to what one built. Perseverant Edge received new assignments, not grand missions, but connective ones, tasked with maintaining channels between communities that no longer agreed on what progress looked like. Vajek accepted the work without ceremony. Translation, after all, was never about creating agreement. It was about keeping difference from becoming unintelligible. As the ship turned slowly, engines humming with familiar imperfection, Vajek looked out at the dark threaded with distant light and felt a quiet, unsettling truth settle in. Humanity had not been elevated or diminished by contact with the listeners. It had been complicated. And that, in a universe that fed on simplicity, might be the most durable state of all. The sixth phase began where no one had planned for anything to begin, in the ordinary accumulation of small decisions made by people who did not think of themselves as participants in any grand experiment. Humanity and the listeners had reached a point where the universe no longer reacted to them as novelties colliding, but as interacting ecologies whose effects overlapped, whether acknowledged or not. There was no new crisis to announce this phase, no threshold crossed with ceremony. There was simply the realization, spreading slowly and unevenly, that the question was no longer how to respond to the universe, but how to remain answerable to it. The phenomenon that fed on unaligned instability did not escalate. It did not retreat either. It became a constant, like gravity or background radiation, a reminder that complexity had predators as well as possibilities. Entire generations grew up knowing its effects as something managed rather than defeated, and that knowledge shaped how futures were imagined. Grand, singular visions of destiny lost their appeal. In their place arose a preference for futures described in plural, branching narratives rather than straight lines. Human societies adapted unevenly, as they always had. Some worlds leaned into layered governance and overlapping truths, building institutions that assumed disagreement as a resource rather than a threat. Others recoiled, choosing tighter coherence within their borders and accepting greater friction without. None of these choices were universally correct. Each carried costs that were paid locally and benefits that rarely translated cleanly elsewhere. The listeners, now braided and diverse within their own continuity, found themselves learning a new restraint. They could model likely outcomes with extraordinary precision, but they had learned that prediction was not permission. To intervene too early flattened possibility. To intervene too late invited collapse. The balance was not fixed. It had to be renegotiated with every context. This ongoing negotiation was where Perseverant Edge found its final purpose. The vessel was no longer unique in capability. Newer ships carried more advanced systems, more efficient drives, more sophisticated translation matrices. Perseverant Edge endured because of what it represented rather than what it could do. It was a reminder of first contact conducted without threat, of answers offered without guarantees, of collaboration chosen rather than compelled. Its continued presence carried symbolic weight that neither humanity nor the listeners dismissed lightly. Vajek remained aboard not out of obligation, but out of recognition that some work did not become obsolete. Translation had grown broader and stranger. It was no longer enough to translate between species or even between civilizations. The hardest translations now lay between versions of humanity that shared ancestry but not assumptions, between listener branches that agreed on memory but not on emphasis, between futures that overlapped just enough to conflict. The work was slow and often unsatisfying. Many conversations ended without resolution. Some ended with mutual frustration, others with quiet understanding that did not translate into agreement. Vajek learned to measure success not by outcomes, but by whether participants remained willing to continue speaking at all. The final test, though no one called it that, emerged from an unexpected convergence. A region long considered marginal, poor in resources and difficult to navigate, began to exhibit patterns that echoed the earliest signs of intelligence. Not a civilization in waiting, not a species on the cusp of abstraction, but something more diffuse. Networks of self-organizing processes spread across stellar debris and energy flows, forming adaptive structures that responded to stimuli without centralized control. It was not alive in any biological sense. It was not technological. It was a way of persisting that defied existing categories. The listeners detected it first, then hesitated. They could model its behavior only partially. It did not exploit instability the way the phenomenon did. It did not stabilize its environment either. It flowed through it, shaping and being shaped in a continuous exchange. It was, in a way that unsettled both humans and listeners, indifferent to the distinction between order and disorder. Humanity encountered it next, through ships that passed too close and found their systems subtly reconfigured, not damaged, but repurposed to serve unfamiliar efficiencies. Crews reported no hostility, no communication, just a sense of having brushed against something that did not recognize them as separate from its environment. Fear followed, inevitably. So did fascination. The question arose quickly and without clean framing. Was this something to protect, to study, to avoid, or to constrain? The listeners had no precedent. Humanity had too many, none of them decisive. What complicated the matter was the phenomenon. Where the new emergence spread, the phenomenon retreated. Not actively repelled, but rendered irrelevant, unable to extract gradients from systems that did not distinguish between stability and flux in familiar ways. The implication was uncomfortable. This new mode of existence did not fight exploitation. It made exploitation meaningless. Some listener branches argued that this emergence represented a superior adaptation, one that could eventually subsume both humanity and the listeners themselves if left unchecked. Others countered that subsumption assumed categories that no longer applied. Humanity, divided as ever, echoed both fears and hopes. There were those who saw the emergence as a threat to agency, a way of being that dissolved individuality into process. Others saw it as a possible answer to the universe's indifference, a persistence that did not require meaning to survive. Vajek listened as the arguments unfolded, aware that this was not about strategy alone. It was about identity. Humanity had defined itself through hands that built, through choices made against entropy and apathy alike. The listeners had defined themselves through listening, through pattern and continuity. This new existence seemed to define itself through neither building nor listening, but through becoming inseparable from context. Intervention was possible. Containment, too. The listeners could reshape the region, imposing gradients the emergence could not metabolize. Humanity could avoid it, fence it off, label it dangerous and move on. All of these choices were available. What no one could model was the cost of acting as if something fundamentally different did not deserve space to exist. The decision that emerged was not unanimous. It never was, but it was sufficient. They would not intervene. They would observe at a distance that acknowledged presence without intrusion. No attempts would be made to integrate, replicate, or suppress the emergence. It would be allowed to persist as it was, neither elevated nor constrained, recognized as part of the universe's ongoing experimentation rather than a problem to solve. This choice satisfied no one completely. It left risks unaddressed and questions unanswered. It also preserved something fragile and essential, the willingness to encounter the unknown without immediately turning it into a mirror or a tool. The listeners recorded the decision with a marker that had no translation into earlier frameworks. Humanity recorded it in arguments that never quite ended, in art and theory and quiet unease. The universe, indifferent as ever, continued. Perseverant edge passed near the region once, at a distance deemed safe by models that acknowledged their own uncertainty. The ship systems hummed, adapted, then settled back into familiar imperfection. Vajek watched the readouts change in ways that felt less like data and more like weather, aware that something vast and subtle was unfolding beyond comprehension. There was no revelation, no closing insight that tied the long arc of contact into a single lesson. There was only a sense of standing within a story that refused to conclude, one where meaning emerged not from answers, but from continued participation. Humanity had not proven itself superior, nor uniquely virtuous. It had proven itself capable of complicating the universe in ways that mattered, of introducing patterns that resisted simplification and exploitation alike. The listeners had not found perfection in humanity. They had found a partner in imperfection, one whose failures were as instructive as its successes. Vajek remained at the viewport long after the region slipped from sensors, watching the familiar spread of stars that had once seemed so empty. The universe had not become friendlier. It had become more crowded with ways of being, each carrying its own risks and possibilities. The measure of humanity, Vajek understood now, was not in what it mastered or preserved, but in what it allowed to exist alongside it without needing to dominate or define it. Hands that built, yes, but also hands that learned when not to reach. Perseverant Edge turned toward its next destination, engines responding with the same stubborn reliability they always had. There would be more drift, more arguments, more failures that refused to teach simple lessons. There would be futures that could not be reconciled and choices made without certainty. Humanity would continue anyway, not because the universe demanded it, but because that, more than any optimization or destiny, was what it meant to be human.